This is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulte. Welcome back to our show. I am so delighted to have Evan Ellis with us again, that he was able to make time to come back to our show. Welcome back to the show, Evan.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
Evan, to continue with what we were talking about, the Chinese presence in Latin America, can you tell us, does the PRC, or China, have police stations in Latin America like it does in the other cities of the world? What's their role?
They do. Right now, among the different so-called police stations that they have, you have police stations in at least Argentina and Cuba, I believe, as well as Peru and Panama, some of the places where you have relatively sizable Chinese communities. And essentially what those stations do is it leverages the Chinese diaspora, the people who in previous generations have come over to those countries. And oftentimes they are set up in the name of offering services to overseas Chinese. But what they really do is they say, well, we would like you to not do this or to do this or maybe not say this, remembering that you have relatives back in China.
You have relatives back in China.
Exactly.
Hello.
Exactly. And it really goes to the broader sense of China's use of its connectivity with the rest of the world in order to exert influence. So in the last show, for example, we talked about how China works through businessmen and politicians and the expectation of benefit to exercise influence. We also talked about how China works through people who have studied and have become government professionals through Confucius Institutes and Hanban to have influence. There are also something called the International Liaison Department of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese work through groups of people, usually high-level leaders who are friends of China, sometimes to coordinate with those leaders to advocate for changes in relations from Taiwan to China or other types of influence. So, for example, senior members of the Honduran military, senior members of the Paraguayan Senate are members of the Friends of China group, and you find them actually, very outspoken in trying to convince their governments to recognize the PRC. But what you allude to with the police station, again, it goes even one step farther. That is leveraging its broader Chinese community, people who at least have some Chinese ethnicity, to try to enlist them. And sometimes it's in business outreach, sometimes it's in political outreach, sometimes it's in other areas. But to me, it's all part of one common thing, which is using multiple different layers of people in context to try to advance Chinese goals. Now, admittedly, a lot of those goals are economic goals, but at the same time, there are political goals and other types of goals that are associated with that. And so that's why just the magnitude of the way that China pursues its objectives.
To me, this is so important because, for instance, you have a multinational like, let's say General Foods, for instance. I don't know that General Foods is in China, but I imagine they are. And let's say the Chinese decide to invade Taiwan. Well, here you have, as an example, a corporation that's doing business with China, many of them. And are they going to encourage or discourage our government from helping Taiwan?
And that's a great question, and it goes to many different levels. So, for example, this year, China had about $450 billion worth of trade with Latin America. China is the #1 trading partner of almost all of Latin America south of Costa Rica. In addition to that, China's invested about $172 billion in the past 2 decades in Latin America. So, if we think that we're having trouble getting companies or countries to speak out against Russia's invasion of the Ukraine and its abuses against the Ukrainian people, imagine the leverage that China has. And it goes far broader than this as well, because frankly, this is something that is becoming increasingly a concern for us. It was once unthinkable, the idea of a U.S. involvement with China in a war, but we know that President Xi has a strong desire to resolve the Taiwan question before the end of his third term in office in 2027. And so if that happens, if we get into a war, it's likely to be a war of global scope. So it's not just a war that would be fought in Asia, but responsible planners, and again, I, as someone who has worked my entire career, both private sector and now in government for the military, these are things that responsible planners have to think about. That what will the PRC try to do? And the reality is that commercial presence, especially in areas like it operates ports in Latin America, it operates telecommunication organizations we talked about, it operates other countries, companies. And so if you want to put in personnel to observe what's going on, if you want to disrupt U.S. deployment flows or U.S. logistics flows in a conflict, if you want to use your economic leverage to convince our partners in the region, well, maybe don't allow the U.S. Use of your air bases, use of your ports in the name of neutrality. So there's all kinds of things that in the event of a conflict that we have to think about. It's not just whether the Chinese have exclusive alliances or basing agreements like they do in Djibouti and Africa. It's what, just with the commercial presence and with the military-to-military relationships that they already have with Latin American militaries, that they could do to create some real serious problems for us in our own hemisphere as part of a broader struggle that we would have to deal with in confronting the PRC over Taiwan.
Very serious. Is the PRC seeking military bases or a military position in Latin America, or it's simply conquering countries by soft power means?
It's a great question. So I believe that within a generation the answer may be different. But right now, there's really not a conscious effort to secure formal basing agreements. So what you tend to see is that as China's power expands, their willingness to do military things tends to expand with their ability to project power. And so, if you look at how the Chinese have built bases in the South and East China Sea, and as that power has expanded into the Indian Ocean, now in Africa, the choke point in the Suez Canal, that was why they built that formal base in Djibouti in Africa, and why they're expanding out into the Pacific.
The key
now.
word is choke point.
Exactly, and frankly, there are three choke points for global logistics geeks. You have the one that's close to China with the Straits of Malacca. Of course, you have the Suez Canal, and then of course the third in our own hemisphere is the Panama Canal. But when you look at those areas, what you realize is that the Chinese really do not yet have the force or the global power projection capabilities to set up formal military bases. They couldn't support them. So why spend the money? Why be so provocative? Now, I have every confidence from what I've seen that if we went to war with China today, they would be able to fully leverage their military relationships in the region, which are substantial, and their commercial relationships, which are substantial, to be able to use those bases either in subversive ways against the United States or possibly even to operate out of them. And the speed and effectiveness with which they could operate out of them is going to be a lot greater, given that they already have those relationships with the militaries. They know the people, they know the bases, they know the logistics of the area.
They also know the bases, but they also have people operating them, Chinese people operating them, don't they?
And that's another great point. So, for example, in another well-known non-military port, Hanban-Tota, which a couple years ago was taken over by the Chinese. And without getting into the details of how that happened, which is another interesting story, but the Sri Lankan government has a strong commercial dependence relationship and a good political relationship with the Chinese. The Chinese were operating that port there in Hanban-Tota. And so when a PLA Navy, basically radar and electronic intelligence collection ship, decided that they wanted to put in port, the Sri Lankan government really couldn't say no. There was no military agreement. The Chinese just said, hey, we want to put into port and resupply here. And so the risk is, for example, in our own hemisphere, if you look at the major new port that the Chinese are building at the 15-berth deepwater port in Chancay in Peru. So if in a future conflict the Chinese say, hey, we want to put on our military ship here just to have peaceful resupply, a future Peruvian government might not be in a position to tell the Chinese port operator not to do that. And so you don't need a military relationship. Obviously that helps, but it's important to understand the risks that come even before you get to something as formal and provocative as a formal military agreement.
what risks could the Chinese presence in the region play if we find ourselves at war with China?
It's a great question. So multiple different layers. So in the period leading up to a war, and again, this is something that I, as a military professional over the years, have had to wrestle through. It's likely you'd see in all dimensions. First of all, the leveraging of diplomatic and commercial weight to try to convince our partners, not to vote against China, not to support an anti-China coalition. Probably also in the name of neutrality, to deny use of their airspace or their ports or other things to the United States. And as you move farther into the conflict, likely that Chinese security service professionals, many go by the name the MSS, the State Security Services, as well as Chinese People's Liberation Army or PLA special teams, could use those logistics facilities or other facilities, like, for example, the Huawei or other telecommunications facilities, to essentially deploy and sustain people into the region. Now, why would you want to do that? For example, in the Caribbean, if many of the very sensitive U.S. deployment flows go through the Caribbean. For those who remember a little bit of World War I and World War II history, the way, for example, in which the Germans would try to hide out just beyond Charamarguas in Trinidad and Tobago to basically try to stop the transatlantic Allied shipping. And so geography hasn't changed, and so the ability of the Chinese to basically impede our flows for deployment and sustainment by shutting down the Panama Canal, by shutting the Straits of Magellan, by trying to observe or maybe even disrupt flows coming out of U.S. bases in the southeast of the United States, or frankly even to try to use migrant flows or other things to put people into the region, to put the U.S. homeland at risk, or frankly even to try to create diversionary flows with allies. So, for example, many of us remember with COVID-19, when we shut down the U.S.-Mexican border and a lot of companies on the Mexican side, we in the United States had problems. And it was because our supply chain is so integrated with the Mexicans in the maquiladora sector that even defense companies were impacted. And so you can do a lot of things, frankly, to screw up the U.S. economy by impacting allies such as Mexico or Central America that we are very tied to. And then finally, as we get into a advanced phase of the conflict, and it's very unpleasant to think about that, but if we found ourselves in a position where the Chinese had occupied Taiwan, if we had lost a number of carriers or other ships, and it was beginning to look like this was going to be a much longer campaign, there probably are some countries in the Americas that would be willing to bet against us. I mean, we have to remember that there was once a point in time in which the Mexicans were thinking about in World War I betting against us to try to recuperate some of their territory that used to have names like Texas and California. And so it is possible. I mentioned the Peruvian base or even the base at La Union, that if we had partners in the region that agreed or were forced to allow Chinese access to those bases, we could suddenly find ourselves dealing with the projection of Chinese warships and aircraft from our own hemisphere. And that's for NORAD, NORTHCOM. These are threats that we're just not used to having to think about. At least we haven't for the better part of a generation.
Yeah. Why is China sending a spy balloon across the region, as well as to the United States and to Canada?
Yeah, great question. And there are actually many spy balloons. So it's interesting. From about the 1990s, one of the areas that I used to work on and still do is transformational military technologies. And so oftentimes, of course, we're used to thinking about what we can do in surveillance from aircraft and, of course, from space. But there is an area between the two that's sometimes referred to as near space. And so the pioneering use of balloons by many different actors in that range of near space has been a matter of development for years and years. That's an area where you're low enough and it's cheap enough. You can steer a balloon, you can loiter around, you can capture certain types of electronic signals that you can't get from a satellite. So if you remember that big 200-foot balloon, what you actually saw in that were these massive antennas. The length and nature of those antennas were such that they could capture certain signals from the ground, maybe even digital packets, digital data packets that are flying around in that altitude. And so on the one hand, being active in that area, it allows you to measure electronics. It allows you to get certain types of images that you can't get as well from satellites. And frankly, it also allows you to measure the ability of your adversary to respond. And so, balloons move pretty slow, and if you do see them with an aircraft, I mean, number one, testing our ability to actually detect and react. And if that reaction is, okay, we shut down our operations, we shut down certain sensitive electronic emissions, then just sending that balloon and seeing how we react, especially in a tense time like now, is something of importance to the Chinese.
It's training. It trains them.
It is, and any time when tensions tend to go up and you want to know more about your adversary and more about your adversary's ability to detect and respond. And so for me, and it was sad how political this has gotten, and understanding that congressmen want answers and others want answers, and there may or may not have been bad decisions made. But I'm sure that the Chinese were listening very attentively to all of those debates, because they wanted to know, well, what are we detecting and when did we detect it, and are we detecting differently now? Because that's part of the point. But this has been something, and again, it showcases the fact that you have a broad range of different balloons and things and capabilities. This is a whole domain for surveillance, and frankly, it's a domain from which you can do other things in terms of attacks and loitering, much like you can do with submarines. And it's a domain that's received, up until now it's become famous, it's received very, very little attention. But it's a very important domain, and one where it's very important for the United States to have both detection capabilities and the ability to respond, as we've seen.
How do Chinese activities compare to those of Russia and Iran in the region?
Great question. So in economic terms, there's no comparison. So to give you an example, Latin America in 2020 exported about $6 billion to Russia. A lot of that was agricultural goods, and that sounds like a lot. But in that same year, Latin America exported about $130 billion to China, and it exported, I believe, something like $400 billion to the United States. And so Russia's not even a blip on the radar screen. In Iran, if Russia's a blip, Iran is an even smaller blip. Now, what happens is there's certain niche industries and relationships. And so, for example, going back to the Cold War, the Russians have sold their military goods to a lot of Latin American states, and they've done military training. Peru, going back to the 1970s under the military regime of Juan Velasco Alvarado, Mexico for a time bought Russian helicopters, Colombia, before the close relationship we have today, in 1994 under a government of Ernesto Samper had bought some Russian helicopters. And so the Russians have, in terms of their military equipment, people who have gone to their military academies, they have a certain hook, and they do certain things in space. They have a satellite navigation system called GLONASS that has downlink stations with Nicaragua and elsewhere, et cetera, et cetera. And in a limited number of commercial sectors. So, for example, in petroleum, and especially with Venezuela, Rosneft, and to a lesser extent, TNK, Gazprom, and others. But in general, the number of countries with which Russia has strong relations are really pretty limited. You have a group of countries that I like to refer to as threat hosts. Those countries which are, because of their orientation, willing to allow Russia and Iran to do provocative things with them. And that's basically, it's Venezuela, it's Nicaragua with the Ortegas, it's Cuba sometimes, and then you have some countries in the middle, depending on who you count, like Bolivia and sometimes Argentina. So on the one hand, Russia tends to be much more willing than China to do provocative things, whereas China has economic relations and they want to play things a little bit safer. And so oftentimes there's a synergy where Russia doesn't have the money and Iran doesn't have the money to do things with these partners. But without Chinese money, those partners wouldn't exist in the region. China doesn't want to do provocative things like deploying major military forces, but when Russia and Iran deploy military forces or do agreements like the expanded personnel agreement that Russia did with Nicaragua recently, China benefits from that, and they sit back without getting their hands dirty, and while the United States has to respond to these things. And so The nature of the engagement, the size, the scope is different. And frankly, there's two things that worry me. One of the things is, as Russia becomes increasingly desperate, time and time again, they've shown that to try to escalate or divert the United States, they oftentimes turn to doing something in Latin America. In 2008, they did this, in 2013. And so the risk is, you could see a Vladimir Putin desperate trying to do things. You also see Iran, especially under the current regime, is increasingly trying to rebuild its former relationship. A lot of that core relationships with Venezuela, you see with oil collaboration in Venezuela and some like UAV and arms collaboration. But you also see that beginning to expand to some of the networks that they had back in the days of a previous Iranian president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And so now with the Ebrahim Raisi government, you see, for example, an outreach in oil and in arms, even to Nicaragua. And so Iran is trying to re-engage. It's still very limited, but it's a bit more directly risky. And frankly, also, if we ever went to war with China, just like today, Russia uses North Korean munitions. Russia gets the support of Iran with the drone program. It's likely that if China was looking to do things in the Western Hemisphere, the presence that Russia and Iran has in the hemisphere would be something that would probably be put in the service of China. So for me, it's important not to just look at the Russian threat or just look at the Iranian threat, but understand how all of these things, without being coordinated, can present a composite risk to us. Yes.
What bothers me is that I wonder if this event, we call it, between Russia and the Ukraine is to sort of like feel out not only the American response and the European response, but also to drain America of its armaments. So that if China decides to engage with Taiwan, we will be drained of many of our armaments.
It's a great question, and I ask myself this, and I'm not sure if there is a coordinated master plan, but I think China is very good at allowing essentially lesser powers, manipulating lesser powers to do things that are of strategic benefit to it. And so when Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping during the Beijing Olympics got together, I suspect that Xi certainly did not discourage Vladimir Putin from invading. Perhaps thought it would come out better than it did, but certainly China right now is observing very closely what's going on in the Ukraine. It's getting lessons. So what type of sanctions, including denial of Russian access to the SWIFT system. So what does China have to think about before it invades Taiwan or before it acts against Taiwan? In addition, exactly some of the resource issues. And so it's ironic right now that we are rapidly depleting our munition stores. We are rapidly depleting our other stores of precision missiles. We are handing over large quantities of weapon systems, and so in many ways that puts our ability to respond as effectively to Taiwan in a sustained Chinese attack against Taiwan at risk. As a matter of fact, it's interesting, two dimensions. One is that we are spending, I think we've spent $113 billion, if I'm not mistaken, basically giving munitions to the Ukraine. There's now talk about China selling weapons to Russia, and right now we already see that China is profiting very handsomely, buying at a discount Russian oil and Russian grain. And so as you see this play out, China is not only learning from the West, but basically while the West economically depletes itself in what I believe is a very important and valiant effort to defend Ukraine, China is actually profiting as its once rival Russia becomes increasingly dependent on it. And now if it starts selling weapons to the Russians, it actually stands to make money off of this with its own arms industry, even at a time when the West is depleting its own stores and depleting its own arms industry. And so this all in very much, China is, I don't think there's a master plan, but China is very effective in leveraging its lesser anti-liberal allies like Russia and Iran to move things to its advantage.
How has Latin America responded to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine?
It's a great question also. And the response has been complicated, but in general, the majority of countries in the region, especially those who consider themselves democratic actors, I think have been relatively embarrassed. You've seen that most of Latin America has been relatively critical of Russia in the votes. There have been a series of about 5 different votes in the United Nations since the invasion took place. Now, you do find a small number of states which have been solidly in Russia's corner, of course, the ones that you expect, especially Venezuela, especially Nicaragua, to a certain extent Cuba. Some of the more on the fence in more illiberal actors, so Honduras, Xiomara Castro's regime has begun to vote less against Russia. You see Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, with which we've had some political problems, has also begun to take a position less cooperative with us. But the other thing that's notable is the region has not provided any type of military aid, and even General Richardson, the commanding general of U.S. Southern Command, has actually openly proposed that Latin American countries that have Russian equipment give that equipment to the Ukraine to use, and in return replace that equipment with U.S. equipment, something that would strengthen our relationship and help Ukraine. However, to date, that's received almost a uniform no from our Latin American partners, explicitly by left of center Gustavo Petro in Colombia, as well as Brazil and in Argentina. So I think it shows that there's a certain amount of ambiguity, but there's also a reluctance of Latin America to kind of get off the fence and really stand up against aggression and for the protection of sovereignty.
What would you like our audience to take away with them?
More than anything is understanding that the biggest challenges strategically to the United States in the region do not necessarily come just from a military invasion, but come from a combination of influence and other activities. It comes from a synergy of different types of challenges that China, together with other illiberal actors like Russia and Iran, can pose, and that it is very important for us to look more closely at the region with which we are intimately connected in terms of bonds of geography and family and economics. I mean, what happens in Latin America when things go badly in Latin America, when other actors such as China establish a firm foothold? It's not just a matter of foreign policy. It impacts us, as we see with immigration and drugs, is a matter of our own domestic policy. And so, it is vitally important that we take a look at the condition that the region has gotten itself into and understand that the very real equities that we have in making sure that our near abroad, our neighborhood is healthy and prosperous.
I want to thank you so much for having come back to our show.
A pleasure to be on the show with you. Thank you.
Until next time, this is Speak Up. I am Sandra Shovey. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day. Goodbye.